Recorded live from a home studio in the Garden State, it's the Backstage Kingdom Podcast. And now, here's your host, Michael Saint Gregory.
The most exciting, the most important part of our Florida project.
I've been thinking on this idea.
For Disneyland?
Beyond Disneyland. I need to do something truly great for this country.
In fact, the heart of everything we'll be doing in Disney World.
I've had him draw up plans for a project in Florida.
We call it EPCOT.
We have designed an experimental
Prototype
community
of tomorrow.
EPCOT boasts a low crime rate, a minuscule prison population,
Everybody fan out and find them!
and a miraculous 100% employment rate.
I break my back for $1 a day.
Wow, now that's a city I'd want to live in.
You do, silly goose.
So you can keep complaining about your numbers, or you can join me in changing the world!
You've already changed the world! Hell, you practically own it!
Slide the beast! Slide the beast! Slide the beast!
Everybody stop!
There are some ideas in themed entertainment that never really die. They don't disappear, they don't resolve, they don't even fully fail. They just linger. They sit in the background like unfinished architecture in the imagination, half blueprint, half ghost story. The kind of ideas that keep resurfacing because they're too strange, too ambitious, too revealing to stay buried for long. And one of the greatest examples of that is Walt Disney's original EPCOT concept. Not the park, not even the version people know now, and not the place people visit for festivals and fireworks and nostalgia and debates about what future world used to be or should be now. I mean the real original idea. The experimental prototype community of tomorrow, as Walt Disney imagined it near the end of his life. A functioning community, a place where people would actually live. A city organized around work, transportation, technology, order, perpetual innovation, and total design. A corporate utopia. A planned tomorrow. A beautiful, deeply unsettling what if. Because the more you sit with the original EPCOT, the stranger it gets. It's visionary. It is sincere. It's theatrical. It's maybe even a little terrifying. And that is exactly why Dis-topia, the EPCOT musical, exists. Dis-topia isn't just interesting because it's a musical about EPCOT. It's interesting because it takes one of the strangest, unrealized ideas in Disney history and asks the question that has been sitting inside that history all along. What if it had lasted? What if people had to live inside it, work inside it, believe in it, break under it, rebel against it, still love it anyway? That is where the premise stops being just a joke. That is where it becomes drama. And this is why I wanted to start this podcast series here. Today I'm beginning a much deeper dive series on Dis-topia, the EPCOT musical. Now, if you've been following my work on my YouTube channel, then you already know this is not my first time talking about this show. I already made a 2-part video series on Dis-topia, and I also had the chance to sit down with the creators and really talk through where this musical came from, how it evolved, what they were trying to say, and why it seems to have connected so strongly with so many people. But the more I sat with that material, the more I kept coming back to the same conclusion. This is one of those subjects that actually gets more interesting the more room you give it. Dis-topia is not just a clever premise. It's not just, what if EPCOT were real? And it's not just, what if Walt Disney's cryogenically preserved head were a character in a musical? It isn't even just one of those deeply niche-themed entertainment projects that happened to break containment online because the concept was strange enough to get people's attention. What makes this particular musical interesting is that underneath the weirdness, the comedy, the sheer delight of seeing something this specific and this unusual find a wider audience, there's a real idea here. There's the idea of the original EPCOT as one of the most revealing, unrealized projects in Disney history. The idea of theme parks not simply as entertainment spaces, but as systems of labor, ideology, control, atmosphere, and belief. And there's the idea that if you take one of Disney history's grandest and most impossible ambitions and let people actually live inside it, what you get is not just whimsy. You get tension, contradiction, the very thin line between Utopia and its namesake, Dis-topia. And for me, that's where this series has to begin. Before I get into the characters or the lore or pulling apart the script, talking about leitmotifs and performances and structure and all other things I want to cover in later episodes, I want to start with history. The road that leads from Walt Disney's original EPCOT concept to a group of young artists decades later deciding that this was the material they wanted to turn into a musical. Because that leap from unrealized urban planning fantasy to student-created musical theater actually makes a lot more sense than it might seem at first. In fact, I'd argue it makes almost perfect sense. Because the original EPCOT story was already dramatically long before anybody wrote a single lyric about it. To me, that is the key. Because if you only know the shorthand version of the EPCOT story, then it can sound like a fun historical footnote. You know the line, you've probably heard it before. You know, EPCOT was supposed to be a real city. And yes, technically that is true. But that sentence compresses so much of what makes the idea strange, ambitious, and revealing. And honestly, a little unnerving. Because Walt's original EPCOT concept was not just a city of tomorrow in some vague retro-futuristic, sleek and optimistic kind of way. It was much more serious than that. This was Walt Disney, late in life, looking at what he saw as the failures of modern urban life, and deciding that the answer was not just to comment on them or to complain about them, or even to build around them. The answer in his mind was to start over, to build a controlled environment from the ground up, to make a place where transportation, architecture, industry, housing, recreation, and civic life would all function together. Because when Walt turned toward Florida, he was looking for freedom from what had happened around Disneyland. And what had happened around Disneyland, from Walt's perspective, was chaos. Motel strips, cheap signage, uncontrolled development, visual clutter, a world outside that ignored the aesthetic logic of the one inside it. Now, if you understand Walt Disney at all, that reaction makes perfect sense. He wasn't somebody who liked leaving the guest experience to chance. He wasn't somebody who liked building half a world and then watching the rest of it get filled in by other people's priorities. He was someone who believed very deeply in a designed experience, in environmental storytelling, in the idea that if you wanted a place to really work, you had to shape all of it, every single detail. So when he and his team began quietly buying up land in Florida, this wasn't just about building a bigger Disneyland, it was about building a total environment. A kingdom, yes, but also a system. And at the heart of that system was EPCOT. That is one of the details I kept returning to, and I think it is still the most important place to start. Walt didn't talk about EPCOT as some side experiment, or present it as a decorative background to the real project. He talked about it as central, as the heart of what Florida was supposed to become. And that changes the way you have to think about it. Because once you understand that, EPCOT stops becoming a curious, abandoned idea and starts looking like one of the clearest windows into Walt Disney's late worldview. A city, not a park. A real place where people would live. A place built around a radial design with a commercial and civic core in the center, with neighborhoods around it. A place where transportation systems would reduce the need for ordinary car traffic in the city center. A place where the visible public environment would be carefully ordered and highly controlled, while service systems and infrastructure did the hidden work underneath, because it was supposed to constantly update itself. And that last part is one of the details I find especially haunting, because Walt did not envision EPCOT as a static monument to a future that had already arrived. He envisioned it as a prototype, a constantly changing environment, a place that would always be introducing new materials, new systems, new technologies, new ideas about how to live. And on one level, that's thrilling. It's thrilling because it's so audacious. It's thrilling because it is so purely Walt Disney in its scale of ambition. He was not saying, let me build a better neighborhood. He was saying, in effect, let me build a model for modern life. That's wild. That is visionary. And that is also where the hair on the back of your neck should stand up a little bit. Because the moment a corporation starts imagining itself not just as an entertainer, or a developer, or a storyteller, but as the architect of daily life, you're in much stranger territory. Now you're not talking about attractions. You're talking about power, governance, labor, social order. You're talking about who gets to decide what progress means, what harmony means, what community means, and who has to live under those definitions. Now that's why EPCOT is not just charmingly weird, it's dramatically loaded, because it's idealistic and controlling at the same time. It's public-minded in the language it uses and deeply top-down in the structure it implies. It's beautiful and unsettling. And that contradiction is not incidental. It's the whole thing. Think about the details people often leave out when they summarize EPCOT too quickly. This was not a place built on the idea of conventional local democracy as most people understand it. Residents would not own their land in the usual sense. They would rent. The city would remain under corporate control. The entire place would be managed as a living showcase. There would be no retirees. Everybody would be employed. The city would remain economically active, socially ordered, aesthetically maintained, and ideologically aligned with the vision. Now, on paper, some of this sounds efficient. Some of it sounds even forward-thinking. Some of it sounds deeply appealing if you are somebody who loves systems and hates urban mess. But all of it together starts to tell a different story. Because what you begin to see is not simply a city of tomorrow. You see a work city, a demonstration city, a place where daily life is folded into the performance of the idea itself. And that is where it gets so rich as dramatic material, because a perfectly ordered city is one thing in a presentation film. It's something else entirely if you imagine what it would feel like to actually wake up there, to live there, to work there, to be told that your environment is always being updated for your own good. To have hidden crews moving through your life in the name of progress. To know that the world around you is designed. To know that your role inside that design has already, in some sense, been decided. To be grateful for the efficiency and claustrophobic because of the efficiency at the same time. This is where history stops being trivia and starts becoming theater. And that is the point for me where Dis-topia starts making perfect sense. Because if you listen closely enough, the EPCOT story is already asking dramatic questions on its own. Who thrives in a world like that? Who resents it? Who buys into it completely? Who notices the seams? Who keeps the place running? And who gets buried by the machinery that allows other people to feel the magic? Who would still find a way to love it despite all of that? That's not a stretch from the history. That is already in the history. And maybe that is one of the biggest misconceptions people have when they first hear about this musical. They hear the premise and assume the creators must have taken some relatively straightforward Disney fact and exaggerated it into satire. But the truth is, they didn't need to exaggerate all that much. The original concept already had the tension in it. A planned city, a controlled environment, a corporately managed future, a smiling rhetoric of progress, a structure that depends on labor and obedience and buy-in. The original EPCOT is not interesting because it was a silly, fascinating idea. It's interesting because it was actually serious. He believed that design and technology and corporate partnership and top-down planning could produce something better than the cities he thought were failing people. And that sincerity is why the idea still has power. If this had been some whimsical side sketch, I don't think it would haunt Disney history the way it does. What haunts people is that this was real. Not real in the sense of built, obviously, but real in the sense of intention. Real in the sense of aspiration. Real in the sense that one of the most mythologized figures in American entertainment wanted this to happen. And the more I think about that, the more I think the original EPCOT may have been one of the clearest examples of themed entertainment trying to step beyond entertainment altogether. Disneyland says, "Come visit the dream." The original idea for EPCOT wanted to say, what if the dream was the social structure? Now that's a very different proposition altogether. Now we're not just talking about guests, we're talking about residents. And not just a visit, but a life. Nor is it just atmosphere, there's governance. And once you cross that line, the moral stakes change. The emotional stakes change. The artistic possibilities change too. Because you can get a whole attraction out of atmosphere. You can get a whole park out of atmosphere. But you get a musical when you start asking what that atmosphere costs. And that, to me, is where Walt himself becomes such a fascinating dramatic figure. Because I do think that people tend to flatten him too easily. He becomes either Saint Walt or Monster Walt. Either the gentle visionary uncle who just wanted to make the world happier and cleaner and more beautiful, or the ruthless control freak whose every instinct leads towards hierarchy, surveillance, and branding. Well, not for nothing, neither version is entirely wrong, but neither version is enough. What's compelling about Walt Disney, historically and dramatically, is the contradiction. He was a visionary. I don't think you can seriously look at the sheer scale of what he imagined for Florida and deny that. The man was thinking beyond parks, beyond rides, beyond guest flow, beyond entertainment product. He was asking what a designed environment could do for human life on a massive scale. And that is as extraordinary as it is dangerous. Because the line between I want to make life better and I think I know how everyone else should live is very thin. And Walt as a figure contains both of those impulses. The desire to create wonder and the desire to control the terms of that wonder. The desire to uplift and the instinct to centralize. The desire to innovate and the certainty that other people should live inside the systems he imagined. Now, this is not me trying to do some simplistic takedown of Walt Disney. Quite the opposite, actually. I think he's much more interesting when you take him seriously enough to acknowledge how contradictory he was. And that, by the way, is exactly why Dis-topia has so much room to breathe as a piece of theater. Because if Walt were only one thing, the show would be much smaller in scale. If he were just a villain, well, the show would be pretty much flat. If he was just a saint, the show would have nothing to say. But if he is both dreamer and dictator, believer and controller, visionary and mythmaker, then the whole world of the musical comes alive around that contradiction. Now, for me personally, one of the reasons this whole topic resonates so strongly is that I've always found themed entertainment most interesting at the point where illusion meets labor. Not where the illusion fails and not where the magic disappears, but where you remember that the magic is being made. That there are people inside the machine. That somebody had to build the set, run the track, maintain the system, clean the street, hit the cue, perform the smile, reset the scene, and keep the atmosphere alive for the guests to believe in it. Because theme parks are not just places of consumption. They're a place of performance, emotional systems built by human beings. And when you start looking at them that way, the original EPCOT becomes even more fascinating. And I know I keep using that term a lot, but it's true. The original EPCOT was not just about designing the guest experience. It was about designing life, designing a means of labor, expectations, movement, belonging. And yes, it designed exclusion too. Who fits the vision? Who doesn't? Who gets absorbed into the rhetoric of progress? And who gets left in the underbelly? That's why the original EPCOT story carries so much pressure in it. And it's why when I started spending time with Dis-topia, I felt almost immediately that the show understood something deeper than just the jokes. It understood the emotional and ideological stakes of themed environments. It understood that the dream and the machinery are not separate. They're the same story, seen from different angles. Once you understand that, the existence of the musical feels inevitable. Because somebody was eventually going to look at this concept and realize this was not just a fan history curiosity. Plenty of video essays have done the same thing with looking into the true story of EPCOT. But when you really look into this story, it was already practically begging to be dramatized. And that I think is the perfect point to pause, because that is the historical ghost at the center of the story, the unrealized city, the contradiction. When I come back, I want to talk about the moment that Contradiction finds its way into a rehearsal room, into a student-run theater culture, and into the imagination of the creators who turned it into Dis-topia. I'll be back with more right after this short break. Welcome back. Before the break, I was talking about the real EPCOT concept itself and why I think the history already contains the dramatic engine that Dis-topia would later build on. So now I want to shift from Florida in the 1960s to California in the late 2010s, because the next part of this story is not about Walt Disney directly, it's about discovery. It's about a group of young artists finding this weird historical pressure point and realizing it was alive enough to become theater. And one of the things that I really love about the origin of Dis-topia is that it didn't begin in some polished, institutional, we have identified a market opportunity kind of way. It began like a lot of genuinely interesting creative work begins now, with somebody stumbling into something online and feeling that jolt of recognition. You know, like how I discovered this musical. Enter Matthew Deegan. He was a screenwriting major, searching for ideas, and he ended up down a Wikipedia rabbit hole. And what grabbed him was not just that the real EPCOT plan was unusual. What grabbed him was that it felt enormous. Now, that is a word I keep coming back to as well, enormous. Not just in scale, but in imaginative charge. Because some historical facts are interesting in a tidy way. They're fun, they're useful, they're the sort of thing that you file away for later. Some historical ideas, though, feel like alternate timelines trying to break through the wall. The original EPCOT is one of those. You hear enough about it and you can already sense the world around it. You can hear the speeches, you can see the model, you can imagine the people living there. You can feel the tension between promise and control. That is story fuel. And what I find so satisfying about Matthew's origin story is that it sounds like he responded to that feeling first. Not with a neat thesis, but with a spark. One little spark, you might say. And that spark was an instinctive, artistic sense that there is something in there. Now, importantly, the earliest version of the project was not exactly the Dis-topia people know now. And this is one of those development details I really enjoy because it reveals how a premise slowly finds its true shape. Matthew has said that the original idea centered more on Roy Disney. The early concept was about Roy trying to carry forward Walt's spark. and grappling with the impossibility of inheriting another person's creative fire. And honestly, that is a pretty beautiful thematic idea. There's something very moving in that, the image of somebody trying to continue a vision that was never really theirs, trying to keep faith with a dead brother's impossible standard, trying to translate one person's force of will into a future that does not quite obey. It's really rich material, but I also completely understand why it wasn't enough on its own, because as Matthew himself admitted, it was more of a theme than a plot. It was thoughtful, it just wasn't theatrical enough. And then came the breakthrough. Walt entered the show as an actual character. And not just Walt as a memory or the looming spirit of Walt Disney, or even Walt as some absent symbolic force. Walt Disney as a physical presence. More specifically, Walt as a preserved head on a table. And look, I know that phrase is still kind of astonishing every time you say it out loud, but that is part of why it works. Because that image is doing several things at once. Obviously, it's hilarious. It's an outrageous sight gag, and it's exactly right for the way of a comedy musical. It's absurd enough to announce that this show is willing to take a giant conceptual swing. But it's also much sadder and sharper than the joke alone would suggest. Because the image of Walt as just a head immediately gives you frustration, limitation, obsession, ego, the desire to keep directing things long after the body and maybe the world itself has changed around you. It's the perfect theatrical embodiment of a man whose vision was bigger than his mortality and whose desire for control has outlived the conditions that once made it possible. It's not just a gag, it's dramatic architecture. And I think that's the point where Dis-topia really becomes itself. Because once Walt is present in that form, the contradictions of the original EPCOT stop being merely historical and become playable. Now you can stage them. Now the visionary can argue, the dreamer can command, the mythology can talk back. Now the show can literalize the force of Walt as a figure without pretending he was ever simple. And to me, that's where the whole premise clicks into place. Not because it gets sillier, because it gets more embodied. And that is a very important difference. A lot of theater, especially heightened theater, lives or dies on whether it can turn abstract tension into a physical situation. And Dis-topia suddenly had one. A city built around a dream still ruled by its own architect. An architect reduced to a head, but no less commanding for it. A world full of people who have to deal with that. Now that is theater. Now, of course, Dis-topia was never just Matthew's idea in isolation, and the more I dug into the making of the show, the more obvious it became that the collaboration itself is a huge part of the story. Enter Robbie Good and Abigail Torrance. Now, they're not supporting footnotes in this history. They are central to it. And what I love about that is that the show itself is about a giant, dominant visionary personality. But the making of the show seems to have depended on a very different kind of structure. Not a single all-powerful voice, a creative triangle, a conversation, a group of people bringing different strengths and sensibilities to the same strange machine. Matthew obviously was shaping the book, the concept, the architecture of the story. Robbie became essential as composer, orchestrator, and musical storyteller. And Abby seems to have been one of those glorious all-hands-on-deck theater people who can move between composition, lyrics, design, performance responsibilities, and general creative problem-solving without ever losing the heart of the thing. And one of the things Abby said when I originally interviewed them that really stuck with me was her own candid relationship to Disney. She said very bluntly that she is a big Disney fan, and she also hates Disney. And I remember hearing that and thinking, yeah, exactly, because that is such an honest way of describing what a lot of us feel about the world. We love it, we critique it, we're moved by it, we get frustrated by it, we understand how artificial it is, and we're still affected by it anyway. We can be impressed by the art form and skeptical of the institution. We can feel the sincerity of the dream and see the machinery that exploits it. That emotional contradiction is not some flaw in the response, it's the real response. And I think it's a huge reason Dis-topia has the flavor it has. Because this musical does not feel like it was made by people who just want to stand outside Disney and throw tomatoes at it. It feels like it was made by people who understand the pull from the inside. And that matters, because complicated love can create richer art than simple contempt. A simple contempt can give you a takedown, but complicated love can give you a world. And Dis-topia, from everything I have seen and heard, is very much a world. Now, the other context that matters a great deal is where the show was born. This was not a commercial development pipeline. It was not a major regional theater commissioning a clever Disney satire. It came out of the Players Society at Chapman University, a student-run environment with a history of original work and a kind of close relationship to irreverence, parody, theatrical experimentation, and figuring it out as you go. And that context is so important because you can almost feel the version of this show that could have existed in that ecosystem if the creators had made a slightly different tonal choice. There is absolutely a universe out there where there's a version of Dis-topia that stays mostly at the level of spoof. A version where the audience is constantly reassured that the show knows how ridiculous its own premise is. A version where Disney references exist mostly for punchlines. A version where irony becomes a shield every time the material gets too close to something sincere. And I want to be very clear. That show probably would have gotten laughs, maybe a lot of them, but it wouldn't have gotten under people's skin in the same way. Both the show itself and my conversation with the creators, I learned that they kept resisting the easy version. They kept choosing sincerity. Sincerity is such a strong word, and it is truly a definition of the foundation of this entire musical process. And I genuinely think it is the axis that this whole project turns on. When I talked to them, that was the thing I felt most strongly. Not just that the show was clever or ambitious. It has beautiful music, great jokes, incredible performances. I really had to let them know that what I felt most strongly was that it was sincere. It let characters mean what they said. It let emotions land. It didn't hide behind mockery. And Matthew talked about that directly. He talked about not wanting to make a mockery of the material. He understood very clearly how easy it would have been to just do a parade of broad, frozen Walt Disney jokes and generic anti-Disney swipes and let the whole thing float at the level of self-aware satire. But that wasn't what interested him. And to be honest, thank goodness for that. Because parody can get you through maybe 5 minutes, 15 max if you're lucky. Sincerity is what gets you through a full 2-hour musical. Sincerity is what makes a character like Vera possible. Sincerity is what allows Walt to feel dangerous because he is emotionally real, not just because he's a symbol. Sincerity is what gives the workers and the Lost Boys characters actual weight rather than turning them into ideological cardboard. Sincerity is what lets the audience feel the attraction of the dream and the violence of the system at the same time. Now that balance is very hard. Much harder than irony, honestly. Irony lets you keep your hands clean. Sincerity requires you to get emotionally involved. And for a premise this bizarre, that is a huge artistic risk. It's also the reason the show matters. Because the original EPCOT itself was sincere. Walt truly meant it. So the only way to do justice to that absurdity of the idea is not to float above it with a smirk or a wink and a nod. It's to meet sincerity with sincerity and let the contradiction stay alive. Now, once the creators found that tonal center, another major reality kicked in. This was not going to work as a straight play. And that makes complete sense. Think about the amount of world building this story has to accomplish. You're not just introducing a setting, you're introducing a whole ideological structure, an alternate historical outcome. You're introducing Walt as a creator, a city as a system, workers as a social reality, believers as an emotional force, rebels as a counter-pressure, and all of the history that sits beneath all of that. That is a lot of layers. And there are only so many ways you can deliver that in straight dialogue before the thing starts sounding like a lecture with set pieces. Music changes that. Music gives you scale. It gives you compression. Music lets the audience feel the world before they have fully sorted it out. Now, the thing about musicals is that the purpose that these characters end up singing songs is because the emotional swell that builds up can only be expressed through such a powerful medium as a song. And I actually think that it's one of the reasons themed entertainment and musical theater belong together so naturally, because both forms are really good at creating emotional legibility through environment. A great theme park land does not hand you an essay, it surrounds you. And a great musical doesn't hand you a dossier, it sweeps you into a logic of feeling. Dis-topia needed that. The original concept for EPCOT is too large and too contradictory to merely explain. It has to be sung into being. And once you understand that, the transition from play to musical feels less like a change in format and more like a discovery of the only form that could truly hold the entire idea. The writing and composition process itself is another incredible part of the history, because it sounds like it unfolded under the kind of pressure that either destroys a project or clarifies it. The show was pitched in 2021, and from there the timeline was brutal. They were essentially told, yes, you can do this in October. And that meant they had about 5 months to write and put together an original musical with this kind of concept. 5 months. Which is frankly insane, but also very theater. And there's something almost poetically appropriate about that. A show about an impossible city had to be built under impossible conditions, not by a giant institution with endless development resources, by students and young artists with a deadline, a theater community, a Kickstarter, and a willingness to say yes to the absurd scale of their own ideas. That is its own kind of audacity. And one of the things I really appreciate about the Dis-topia story is that the early version does not sound like a mess so much as a pressure cooker. The script was still being finished, and the production was still taking shape. Roles were shifting, people were wearing multiple hats, especially Abby. The scale of the thing was bigger than the resources around it, and yet, from what the creators and the cast have said, the core shape of the show was remarkably stable early on. This suggests that the real development story here is not one of endless reinvention, but rather a story of refinement. The spine was there, the basic argument was there, and the major characters were there. The later work was about helping the show become more fully itself. That's a very different kind of development story, and in some ways, a more encouraging one. It means the original spark was sturdy. The show did not survive because people kept patching over a broken promise. It survived because the premise was strong enough to withstand revision. I think that is the one reason the history of Dis-topia feels so satisfying. Or at least it's one of many. It wasn't a novelty. It wasn't something that accidentally wandered into meaning. It was already a meaningful idea, it just needed time to grow into its full theatrical form. One of the things I love most about student and emerging theater history is how often the practical details are both ridiculous and deeply revealing, because grand artistic ambition always has to pass through utterly mundane obstacles. Who's rehearsing where? Who can get to campus? Who can conduct? Who's sewing? Who's carrying props? Who's reworking a scene at the last possible second? Who is trying to solve an enormous conceptual problem with whatever tape, furniture, lighting, and volunteer energy happens to be available? That is real theater. And it's also why the making of Dis-topia mirrors its subject in such a strangely beautiful way. Because the original EPCOT concept as a historical dream was all about systems. And theater is also systems. Not in the same scale, obviously, but in principle. A musical is designed environment. It's cueing, rhythm, space, behavior, hidden labor, visible effect, emotional architecture. It's one of the few art forms where the machinery and the magic are constantly leaning on each other in real time. So a musical about living inside a designed system was always going to become, in its own making, a story about invisible work, collaboration, compromise, and logistical invention. That is part of why I find the production history moving, not just impressive, but actually moving. It's one thing to say, well, wouldn't it be funny if someone made a musical about EPCOT? It's another thing to actually do it. To write it, to score it, to stage it, persuade people to commit to it, to build the world. And by all accounts, the people around this show did exactly that. And one of the strongest parallels between the real EPCOT story and the story of Dis-topia is the role of scale. Walt had, as he put it, the blessing of size in Florida. Thousands of acres, political leverage, corporate resources, national attention. The possibility of designing an environment so large that it could reshape the terms of the experiment. The Dis-topia team did not have that kind of scale, obviously. What they had was a different kind of scale. They had a huge idea. They had a collaborative community. They had enough artistic conviction to treat a weird premise like serious material. And in some ways, that is a kind of blessing too. Not landmass, imagination. Not infrastructure, theater people. Not government districts and industrial partners, but rather a crowdsourced website and a room full of people willing to try. I find that parallel really charming, honestly, because it would be easy to over-romanticize it, and I don't want to do that. This wasn't Walt Disney World. It was a student-born musical. The scales are not comparable in practical terms, but the audacity? Very comparable. The willingness to look at an absurdly large concept and say, yes, we are going to make a version of this real. That rules. There's no other way to say it. And that is one reason the history of the musical feels so thematically appropriate. A show about ambition had to be made by ambitious people. A show about systems had to be built through collective effort. A show about a gargantuan design dream had to pass through all the human messiness of making performance happen. That's the kind of friction I love in themed entertainment history as well. So many park projects begin in concept art or polished presentations. They begin as pure promise. Then reality enters: budget, politics, engineering, labor, scheduling, compromise. The world intrudes. And that intrusion is not always the death of art. Sometimes it's the thing that gives the art its shape. And I think Dis-topia feels very aware of that. The show understands the distance between a dream on paper and a world people actually inhabit. And the making of the show seems to have taught the creators that in practice as well. Now, as the show moved beyond its earliest version, this is where I think the history gets pretty interesting. Because Dis-topia did not just happen once and vanish. It evolved. It kept being worked on. It kept being refined. And one of the most important things to understand about the later evolution is that it wasn't just cosmetic, it was structural, musical, emotional. This is where things like the expansion of the song Neverland become really telling. What had started as a much smaller Vera moment grew into something bigger, something more ensemble-driven, something more capable of carrying the end of Act 1. And that, to me, is one of the best examples of a show learning how to think more theatrically, but at scale. Because as good as a central premise may be, musicals live or die on how they distribute emotional weight. Who gets a song? Who gets a perspective? Where does the act break? How does the act break land? Whether the end of a section feels like one person's feelings or the world's feelings. And from everything the creators said, they were learning that in real time. They were learning that certain characters needed more internal life, that certain relationships needed stronger articulation, that certain moments had to do more than simply move the plot. They had to clarify the moral architecture of the piece. That's the kind of growth I find really exciting, because it means the creators were not just adding more, they were getting more specific. The same goes for later editions like His Happy Place, which by all accounts became a crucial part of opening up Walt in a more complicated way and clarifying Act 2. And this is such a fascinating development. Again, there's that word. In fact, you could probably do a count of how many times I've said it by now. But it speaks directly to the thing I think the show understands best. Walt cannot just be the villain. He has to remain recognizably human in order for the whole machine around him to feel real. One of my favorite moments in my conversation with the creators was talking about sincerity in relation to Walt, because I genuinely do think that this is where the show gets dangerous, but in the best way possible. If Walt is only monstrous, the audience can dismiss him. If Walt is emotionally legible, the audience has to grapple with him. And that, let's face it, is much more compelling. That's why a number like His Happy Place and the way it intersects with memory, with hometown longing, with the, again, sincerity of what Walt thought he was reaching for matters so much. Because it allows the audience to understand not just the outer rhetoric of Walt's control, but the inner logic of his belief. And let me tell you, that is a much harder thing to dramatize than it looks. Anyone can make a tyrant funny, but it's harder to make a visionary tragic. It's harder still to make him both at once. And that, to me, is one of the most impressive things about the show's evolution. It kept moving toward complexity and not away from it. That complexity also shows up in the score itself. And I know I'm not doing the full musical deep dive yet. We're going to have to wait for the next episode. Because let's face it, it really does deserve its own episode. But I do think the history of the score belongs in this conversation, because it tells you how seriously the creators were taking the piece. And this is where Robbie Good comes in, and his role here is enormous, not just as composer, but as orchestrator and musical dramatist. And one of the things I find most exciting about his comments on the score is that he talks about orchestration as storytelling. Different characters have different sonic worlds. Vera lives in one kind of sound, the Lost Boys in another, Walt in another one. Instrumentation itself becomes perspective. Timbre becomes ideology. That's exactly the kind of thing that can differentiate a musical from good student work to a serious piece of storytelling. Because it means the music is not merely accompanying the script. It's thinking. It's arguing. It's shaping audience understanding on a level deeper than words. And then, of course, there's the scale-up. The larger production, the giant printed scores, the fact that the whole thing eventually ballooned into this genuinely massive orchestral undertaking with a live 25-piece orchestra and a score so large it had to be split into multiple volumes. That is not just a cute production fact. That right there is a declaration of belief in the material. You don't build out a score like that for something you think is disposable. You make something that big and that epic because you think the material deserves the magnitude of that music. And I love that. Partly because it is gloriously excessive, which is always catnip to me in theater history. But also because it says the creators did not treat this as a little throwaway oddity. It was, for all intents and purposes, legitimate and meant to be taken seriously. A big musical. A musical worth orchestrating as if the world inside it deserved full sound. It is certainly, among so many reasons we've listed so far, why the show captured people the way it did. The creators believed in it enough to go large. Now, I also want to spend a little time on the cast and the culture around the show, because I think that, too, is clearly a very deep part of the history. One of the things that came through in my interviews, both with creators and performers, did not feel like a cold assembly of hired talent brought in to execute somebody else's product. It felt like a community of people who were helping shape the identity of the thing. That feels a lot like Walt bringing together his Imagineers to make EPCOT. Performers brought interpretations with them. Existing relationships mattered. The chemistry of the cast mattered. The inside jokes mattered. The fact that many of these people came from adjacent theater and themed entertainment sensibilities, it all mattered. It's, again, a reason the show feels lived in rather than merely devised. because it was not just written at people, it was built with them. That kind of collaborative culture can make a huge difference in a musical, especially one that needs a very specific tonal balance. When the premise is this odd, the ensemble has to believe in the world for the audience to believe in it. The performers can't play it at a distance. They have to commit. They have to really sell the emotional reality of the absurdity of it all. And from everything that I have seen, the countless amount of times that I have watched it and listened to it, that commitment is all over this. One of the aspects of the show I find especially compelling is the way it draws from theme park culture without merely flattering people who know the references. There are insider details in there, little bits of labor culture, attraction culture, cast member adjacent behavior, Disney adult logic, park worker logic, all the tiny little specifics that signal this material is being made by people who understand the ecosystem they're writing about. But it never feels like those details are there only to get a little knowing nod. They're there because the world of the show is rooted in actual experience. And to me, that is a huge distinction. A shallow Disney-adjacent piece references the parks from the outside. A deeper one references them from the inside. It understands not just what the symbols are, but what they feel like when they become part of your daily vocabulary. The gestures, the language, the emotional patterns, the way themed environments can rearrange how people move and speak and imagine themselves. That's where Dis-topia starts to feel less like internet novelty and more like art made by people who have really sat inside the contradictions of this culture. I don't think the show's audience response is all that surprising. Of course, Disney hardcore fans are going to respect the EPCOT angle. Theme park people are going to respond to all of the labor jokes. But musical theater people are going to also respond to the structure and the score angle. And underneath all of that, there's something more, ironically, universal in play. Belief and disillusionment, control and resistance, the difference between the story a system tells about itself and the lives that system produces. And that is not niche. That's just good drama. That's why the history of the musical matters so much, because it shows us that the creators did not simply latch on to a funny premise and decorate it. They found a historical contradiction with real emotional depth and kept digging until the musical could hold it. Now, there is another reason I think starting this podcast series with the history of it all matters, and it has less to do with Dis-topia as a single work, and more to do with themed entertainment as an art form. Something that I am more than willing to argue about with anybody. One of the things that I care about most across everything I do is pushing back against the idea that theme park history is somehow lesser material. That it's too trivial, too corporate, too niche, too unserious to support deeper conversation. Because I don't think that's ever been true. Theme parks are giant cultural machines. They are architecture, music, labor, choreography, visual storytelling, crowd psychology, logistics, ritual, hospitality, spectacle, and ideology, all wrapped together. They're one of the most complete mixed media art forms in modern life. And because of that, they're also one of the most revealing ways to talk about how institutions create feeling. That is why the original EPCOT matters. It's not just a Disney oddity. It's one of the most naked expressions of a cultural force trying to turn design into social order. And that's why a musical like Dis-topia matters too. Because it says, no, this material is not too strange or too niche or too park nerdy to sustain real theater. In fact, it's the exact amount of strange and rich enough to do so, which is worth celebrating. And not just because I happen to love theme parks and musicals and weird lost projects, though obviously at this point, if you haven't figured it out, I really do. I think it's worth celebrating because it broadens the conversation about what themed entertainment can mean. Not just as nostalgia or fandom, but as actual art, as something to critique, as history, as an expression of the human condition. Now, while that may seem grandiose and maybe a little over the top for some people, I think that Dis-topia really does sit at the intersection in a very fascinating way. It's affectionate without being submissive, critical without being glib, absurd without abandoning emotional truth. And I think that the balance traces all the way back through its development, back through the creator's own contradictory relationship to Disney, back through their decision to resist easy parody, back through Matthew's original discovery of EPCOT as more than a fact and more like a haunted space of possibility, back through Walt's own impossible dream. That whole chain matters. Now, as I bring this first episode toward a close, I keep returning to one image in my mind. Not Walt's head, though obviously that image has done a lot of work for this show and for all of us talking about it. Now, the image I keep coming back to is a blueprint. A blueprint for a city that never got built. A blueprint that survives in archives and fan memory and documentaries and D23 articles and late-night park history conversations and all the strange afterlives that unrealized Disney ideas tend to have. And then, years later, another kind of blueprint. A script draft. A piano line. A lyric. A score too large to bind. A student production. A remount. A thesis. A company of people trying to turn a giant idea into something others can actually experience. That parallel is what gets me. Because Walt's EPCOT remained unfinished. Dis-topia is what happens when another set of artists decide to finish a different version of the question. Not the city itself, but the drama inside the city. The human cost. The seduction and the absurdity. The people who would have to wake up inside somebody else's perfect tomorrow. That is what makes the history of Dis-topia not just charming or impressive, but artistically resonant. It's not simply that some very talented people wrote a musical about EPCOT. It's that they recognized the original EPCOT as one of the richest unsolved tensions in Disney history and treated it as something worthy of real dramatic attention. They saw this, and they realized this wasn't just a curiosity, it was a pressure point. A place where Disney mythology, labor politics, urban fantasy, corporate control, optimism, memory, and personal longing, they were all just creating this friction against each other. And they turned that friction into theater. That is the achievement. That's why I think this show has stuck with people that have witnessed it. Because beneath the novelty is a serious instinct. The instinct to ask what happens when a dream becomes a system. The instinct to ask what it means to live inside somebody else's idealized future. The instinct to ask whether a designed environment can ever really make room for untidy, opinionated, difficult human beings. These are human questions. And that is ultimately why Dis-topia matters to me. It matters because it understands that themed entertainment is not shallow simply because it's entertaining. It matters because it takes one of the strangest corners of Disney history and reveals the emotion and ideological complexity already hiding there. It matters because it remembers the workers. It remembers the believers. It remembers the systems are made of people. And it matters because it is one of those rare pieces of work that can make me laugh at the absurdity of its own setup, and then a minute later, make me think very seriously about how institutions shape lives. That's a great accomplishment. So if I had to summarize the history of Dis-topia as simply as I can, I think I would put it like this. A group of young artists found one of the most ambitious, unrealized ideas in Disney history. And they discovered that it was already halfway to being a stage story. And they had the good sense to write it not as a cheap parody, but a funny, strange, and deeply human musical about what happens when Utopia becomes daily life. That's the history. That's the foundation. And that is why I wanted this podcast series to start here. Now, next time, I'm going to break down the characters and the script as a whole. And absolutely, the next episode after that will be all about the score. But before I talk about leitmotifs and performance choices and structural decisions and all the rest of the wonderful material still ahead, I want to make sure that we had our footing. I want to make sure we understood that Dis-topia did not appear out of nowhere. It grew out of a real historical ghost. The city that Walt Disney never got to build. The dream that never quite died. The contradiction that sat waiting for artists to do something with it. And then finally, someone did. That is where Dis-topia comes from. And that's why I think it deserves to be taken seriously. One man's dream became a reality, and all it took was one little spark of inspiration. Thank you so much for joining me on this first episode in the series. Next time, I'm going to be going deeper into the actual architecture of the show itself, the characters, the functions they serve, the emotional positions they occupy, and why the central conflict works as well as it does. Now that we've understood the historical groundwork, the next question becomes, how did the creators turn all of that into actual drama? And trust me, this is where things get even more interesting. I've been Michael Saint Gregory, and until then, I'll see you real soon.